Welcome to the first lecture of this module. Today, I will offer you an overview of where does Europe stand in the 1900s and how do we get to the outbreak of the First World War. So this is the plan for today. I will repeat some introductory remarks to this module. You can find you may find a further elaboration on the module and what we're aiming to do here further up in the Moodle in my two introductory videos. Then I would like to introduce you to the intricacies, the different iterations of the map of Europe. We hopefully the task here is to get you to familiarize with the different configurations that the European continent in political and geopolitical terms has had from the early 1900s all the way through to our day. Then the third point in this lecture is I will try and convince you and get you excited as to why does it make sense to be studying the history of Europe today. I hope this is something that will get you excited and get you interested in the topics we will be covering. Fourthly, I will be offering a broad overview of how we find Europe in the 1900s, before the First World War, and explaining the causes and what led to the First World War. Now, with regards to the introduction, a very, very brief synopsis of what I've already said. The first point of contact with regards to what we're doing is the Moodle page. Log in, go week by week there, and please read carefully what I have put in the relevant Moodle page for each week. I'm explaining the different segments. I'm also using text to explaining how we move on from the first segment to the other one, and occasionally I have links there of things I would like you to further view. And please do not forget to click on the reading lists online section where you could actually see the required reading for each week. What we'll be doing in the tutorials, as mentioned already, we will be working with your presentations, your group presentations, based on specified topics each week. This is task 3 in each week's material. Now, for this first lecture, obviously there is not enough time to prepare a group presentation for you to prepare a presentation, so we will have a round discussion in the tutorial. Assignments, remember the one presentation, which will be the group presentation, will be submitted after the end of in the relevant submission point after the end of the presentations, all of them, and counts 20% of the mark. And here I assess your your skill and your ability to work together in groups. And then the second portfolio assessment, 3 components: an individual PowerPoint based on a pool of questions, a video or audio response based on a separate pool of questions, and a 750-word review of a specific either article or book chapter, again based on a list of suggestions. And with regards to how do you approach me, there is an official office hour booking system on top of the Moodle, but I'm very happy to answer your queries via email and set up different times to have a chat. Okay, so let's now try and acquaint ourselves with the map of Europe. Now, what we see here on the map, I guess, is something quite familiar to us, isn't it? This is the Google Maps iteration of how the European continent is today. And there will also be an online quiz on the Moodle where you can actually try and give it a go yourselves, where that online quiz asks you to identify various different countries. So that's actually a very useful way to see what kind of regions in Europe you're not very familiar with. And I'd like your feedback in the tutorial. Let's go back a century. And this is pretty much how Europe looked in the early 1900s. And what is here to observe? I guess someone might say, if we were in class, I would have asked you, and then I would be looking forward to your thoughts on this. Someone might say, neater in a way, less fragmented states, bigger states. That's one way of saying it. Empires. This is another way of saying it. And let's see how this evolves. From the 1900s, we go to after the First World War. And again, notice the difference from maybe a kind of more orderly, maybe a neater configuration to some kind of bigger fragmentation. And there we see some of the empires have broken up, have been dissolved, essentially, especially in Central Europe and Southeastern Europe. We have new states that didn't exist before, such as Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia. This will be one of our group presentation tasks, by the way, and different other configurations. Notice the USSR, right? And then a third snapshot, the Cold War. Again, a different kind of organization of Europe, a division that some say to this day might still hold between West and East, another kind of division. And what's interesting here is also the two different poles in this Cold War division viewed the world from different perspectives. And what you see in the second image from Time magazine in the 1950s is actually how the two worlds look from a USSR perspective, and then see how the map of Europe in this kind of iteration of the globe gets really kind of lost. Europe becomes a much less significant player. And in the right hand, then you see a more familiar map of Europe based on the NATO countries and the Warsaw Pact countries division. And a key project that we will talk about in the course of this module is the European Union project, and then see how the map of Europe looks if we were to define it based on what kind of states are part of the EU and what kind of states are not. Well, you don't need me to say that now that 1973 UK piece of the map will probably be no more. But that gives us another iteration of the map of Europe. If we, based on what the European Union is, has been, and looks like. So, to round up this discussion, this subsection, what is interesting and what we will see in the course of this semester is actually the different shapes that the European continent has taken. And this is also reflected in the different maps I presented to you. It is a story that is quite complicated, but it's a story and a set of events that has been central to the way we understand our life today in Britain and in the world. It is a story of national fragmentation, whereby certain empires dissolve and then new nation states are created. It is a story of different kinds of power balances. That's a more familiar theme when we talk about the Cold War. It's a story of transition from powerful empires to different kinds of nation states. And it's also a story about the changing influence of Europe in the world, and it's become very evident when we talk about decolonization and the emergence of the European Union. Now, I want to finish this segment by trying to convince you why does it make sense to study the evolution and the different iterations of 20th century Europe today. And I'll offer a couple of thoughts on this. And again, my aim is to get you excited about this module. One, to get a broader perspective on contemporary events. And let me talk about some contemporary events. One is these stories about migration and displacement that proliferate in the media. We hear about people being trapped in the Channel, people coming from all sorts of non-European places and wishing to have a better future in Europe. We also hear about, and I hope you remember, this unprecedented refugee wave coming from Syria through to Europe. People trying to explain, leave a violent civil war and try to find a better future in Europe. And only the Syrian civil war has brought about the death of more than 500,000 people and rendered 12 million people displaced. And for instance, just an example, in 2016-17, a few years ago, more than 500,000 people risked their lives crossing the Mediterranean from the other side of the Mediterranean towards the European side of the Mediterranean, in Greece and in Italy. So we have been today exposed to these stories of misery, stories of people looking for a better future, stories of people seeking to avoid war and the destruction of their own lives. And this is not a new story. And especially 20th century European history shows us how this is not a new story. For instance, just a couple examples. The First World War rendered more than 13 million people as refugees, and 4/5 of them, the vast majority of them, were uprooted in Eastern Europe. The aftermath of the Second World War left 30 million people dislocated across Europe, and you don't need me to, remind you of the misery of Europe's Jewish populations. Just an iconic example here, and this I kind of find that this image is quite striking because they point to the relevance of this theme across 20th century Europe. The picture on the left is refugees coming from what ended up becoming the Turkish state in 1922 to Greece. There was a war between Greece and Turkey that produced a lot of refugees. Orthodox refugees coming from Turkey to Greece, and there were also refugees going from Greece to Turkey. And then 2015, Syrian refugees came through to Europe via the Aegean Sea. So for instance, in the case of the Aegean Sea, which is a sea across the Mediterranean, we have the witnessing of events that are pretty much similar in nature, only 1 century apart. Again, stories of humanitarianism and international cooperation we find today, we switch on the TVs, there's an appeal, for instance, from the Save the Children Fund and other funds to help people fleeing war and destruction. Well, if we go back to 1918, like more than a century ago, then we find the beginnings of humanitarianism as we know it today. That's another example. In the post-Second World War, international organizations came into being, such as UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation administration, and it's kind of the cousin of the higher of existing UN organizations. Another reason to study the history of 20th century Europe is the coming together of international and multinational unions that play a key role in our lives. And you don't need me again to speak about the European Union and the whole Brexit question. I'll try to not to mention it too much, as it's been very well discussed. But we have all sorts of unions that some of them survive, others don't, that have been the product of international cooperation across 20th century Europe. And the final bit I'd like to offer to you as an example of why it is relevant to study 20th century Europe today is actually the proliferation of empires, formal and informal. Today, nobody really thinks, right, that there's something like the British Empire or even the French Empire. We have understood that decolonization has taken shape, and these European countries like Britain, France, and others are not really empires. However, the question I'd like to pose to you is that, has imperialism vanished, disappeared? Are there any informal ways through which imperial power still prevails today in Europe and projects certain values across the world? Think of these debates about, the colonial heritage, Black Lives Matter, and so on. So that's another dimension I'd like you to keep in mind. And hopefully by now I have kind of made the case as to why it's relevant and interesting to study the history of 20th century Europe. Just to explain this final slide, which links to the theme of empires. I don't know whether you know this person on the left, Gaddafi. He was the almighty dictator of Libya for a long time. And Gaddafi, in 2009, visited, the first state visit, Italy. Italy used to be the colonial overlord of Libya for a certain period of time. And to show the fact that Libyans have not really forgotten about imperialism, Gaddafi chose to wear to put a photograph in his suit that depicted a scene of colonial violence, namely Italian troops killing Libyan people in the early 1900s. But again, the complexity of imperialism here is that Gaddafi was a blood-stained dictator. So there's a lot of interesting things going on, even in current politics. This is from 2009, where we can find similar instances today, where the legacies of empire, but also the intricacies of informal imperialism are being brought into light. And this is a key dimension when we think of 20th century European history.